Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on the very first day of April. I'm excited to be joining one of our amazing Goizueta professors, Kristy Towry, who's been wonderful to share her webinar presentation with us. This was originally intended for our Charlotte Emory Engages event last month, but with so many things changing, we've been able to pivot to a digital platform and are thrilled to bring her presentation to you in this format. This is part of our digital learning opportunities with the Emory Alumni Association, so thank you so much for joining us. We have some great content up all the time, and we have really been able to pivot and turn a lot of our in-person events to digital opportunities in these coming months as we are social distancing with the COVID-19 epidemic. With that, I want to remind everyone that this is going to be recorded. So if for any reason you have to step away from your device, don't worry. The full recording will be sent to you within 24 hours, so you can replay it at your leisure. And you will also have the slide embedded in the recording, so you can see the visuals as well. As a reminder, also, with the full live recording, there's a question box in the GoToWebinar platform. Feel free to type your questions throughout the presentation, and I'm going to ask those of Dr. Towry at the end of her presentation. So if anything comes up, or if you'd like clarification on anything, go ahead and put those in, and we will get to those at the end of her presentation. With that, I want to welcome Dr. Towry and hand it over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to see you all here today to talk a little bit about the value of distance. And today it's psychological distance. Before we get started, I want to introduce a group of collaborators. These are the different folks that I've been working on these projects with over the last several years. That's me up in the top left. Next to me are two former Ph.D. students of mine, Ivo Tafkov, who's now at Georgia State, and actually was just promoted to full professor. And then we have Willie Choi, who's on the faculty of Wisconsin now. On the bottom row, the first person you see is Gary Hecht, who might have taught some of you. He is a professor now at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And then two of our current PhD students, Zach Weiser and Jake Zurich, who are collaborators on this going forward. A little bit about me. I have been at Emory's Goizueta Business School for close to 20 years now. Most of that time I've been teaching MBA students. I'm so happy to see that some of my former MBA students are in the group today. I promise to not cold call you just this once. For the last 5 years, have not been teaching. I took a stint in the Dean's office, serving as the Vice Dean for Faculty and Research for the Business School. I stepped down from that role January 1st, so I'm thrilled to be back in my real job of doing research and very soon to be back in the classroom. So, distance. As Lane mentioned, this was originally supposed to be an in-person talk. But because of what's going on in our world today, I'm here virtually because we now understand the value of physical distance in a pandemic. Now, we're all experts on it, right? We've been thinking a whole lot about physical distance. For me, though, I've been thinking about distance for years, not just since this pandemic. But it's a different kind of distance. It's psychological distance. So today, I'm going to talk about psychological distance. I am not going to give you any advice on COVID-19. We have some incredible experts on that topic at Emory University and the CDC, and I know you're all tuned in listening to them often. I am not one of those experts. I'm a business school professor. So we're going to take our minds off of COVID-19 for a while. We're going to have a chat about psychological distance and the value of psychological distance for decision making. This is going to be an academic talk. We're going to talk about research and we're going to talk about theory in a way you might not have thought about these things, maybe even since you were back in school. But because I'm a business professor, I am going to try to turn this back into some practical implications for you in your own life as well as your business life. So let's start off with the definition. Psychological distance is a subjective experience that something is close or far away from the self here and now. I'm quoting Trope and Lieberman today. Trope and Lieberman are some of the ones that gave us a lot of our knowledge on psychological distance that serves as the basis of my own research on this topic. And it's a notion that shouldn't be too hard to understand, because when we think about the words close or distant, we don't always mean physical distance. I think something's going on with my boyfriend. He just seems so distant. Oh, I heard your aunt died. Were you close? Neither of those sentences has anything to do with physical distance, but we all know what it means. So psychologists call this psychological distance. It's something that you understand. I hardly even need to define it, but for the sake of completeness, let's talk about what we feel psychologically closer to. We feel psychologically closer to people that we know instead of complete strangers. We feel psychologically closer to things that are real versus things that are hypothetical or imaginary. We feel psychologically closer to events that happen to us versus events that have happened to somebody else, family, or even more distant are events that happen to strangers. We feel psychologically closer to events that happen close by, domestically versus internationally, and events that will happen very soon or have happened quite recently versus events that happen further away in time. Now you'll notice with psychological distance, we're not just talking about distance between people. It's distance from people, events, objects, all kinds of things, like a virus. You're going to feel a lot closer to this COVID-19 situation as it starts to affect people that you know. So there are two general questions that have been occupying my time and attention related to psychological distance and decision making. These questions are, first, do we learn more from our own or others' experiences? This is about psychological distance because clearly our own experiences are psychologically closer to us than others' experiences. Do we make better decisions for ourselves or for others? Once again, the decisions that we make for ourselves feel much more psychologically near to us than the decisions we make for others. Now, as my students will remember, you already know the answer to these questions because the answer to all interesting questions is the same. It depends. But we're going to leave a little bit of a drum roll in this relationship to talk about, not in this relationship, in this presentation, to talk about what exactly the answer to these questions depends on. Let's talk about some theory. And the body of theory I'm going to talk about is called Construal level theory. We've learned about the effect of psychological distance and construal based on research, a lot of which is by Trope and Lieberman, who I mentioned before. We construe things differently depending on whether they are psychologically close or distant. Let's look first at this situation of psychological closeness. Okay, you are the blue guy there. And I put a box there to represent something that you are psychologically close to. That might be a person, a decision, an event. It's something that you're psychologically closer to. When you are psychologically close, you tend to focus on the details. In a tree versus forest question, you are all about the trees. You tend to think about things in very concrete terms. Now assume that you're psychologically distant from something, a far psychological distance. Here you're thinking about the forest, not the trees. You're focused on the big picture, and you tend to think of things less concretely and more in an abstract manner. We call this construal level. And the way the psychologists would talk about this is they would say if you're psychologically close to something, then you have a low construal level. And if you're psychologically distant from something, then your construal level is much higher. This has been described as how versus why. A high construal level tends to make you think why, and a low construal level tends to make you think how. So let's practice on this a little bit. What do you see here? What is it? Some of you might say, well, that's an electronic device or a communication device. That is a very high level of construal. You could also say this is a mobile phone. You could say it's a phone. You could say it is an iPhone. Or if you get to a very lower level of construal, you're going to be much more specific and realize, oh, it has that little button on the bottom that isn't there in the newer models. That's an iPhone 7. All of those descriptions of what you're seeing are correct. It is a communication device, and it is also an iPhone 7. So construal level is not about correct or incorrect, but it's just a different way of seeing the same object. What's happening here? Well, if you have a high level of construal, you might say, having fun, people having fun. A lower level of construal might say, oh, they're playing schoolyard chasing games. A very low level of the construal would recognize that this is a specific game. They're playing duck, duck, goose. All of those answers are correct, but they represent different levels of construal. One more, vacation. A high level of construal might lead you to think of vacation as simply relaxation away from home. A low level of construal would have you thinking about airplane tickets, hotel reservations, tickets to Disney. Once again, all correct, but different levels of construal. The important thing to remember, and this is based on a lot of psychology research, is that your psychological distance from something affects the level of construal you tend to take when you're thinking about that thing. So let's get to that first question of the two questions that have been occupying my time. The first one is, do we learn more from our own or others' experiences? Remember, your own experiences are psychologically closer to you than others' experiences. Now, if you look at Emory University and other top universities, you hear a whole lot of discussion about experiential learning, learning from doing, learning from your own experiences. But there's this other type of learning, learning from others' experience, that we call vicarious learning. And so we've done a couple of projects on vicarious learning and its value. When is vicarious learning, which is a more psychologically distant kind of learning, when is it more valuable than experiential learning? Before we answer that question, I think we have to go back to the more basic question. What is learning? As you can imagine, scholars all over the world have studied learning for a long, long time and have lots of definitions. For our purposes here, we're going to have a very, very simple definition of learning. When I talk about learning, I mean causality. It's figuring out how my actions affect outcomes. It's figuring out if I push this red button, is the light going to turn on? That's the learning we're going to be talking about, learning about causality. Now, maybe you're asking a question now of, why does a business professor care about learning? Doesn't that sound like something more than an education professor might be interested in? Well, I think any of you who have been in business understand that a whole lot of success in running a business is in learning about causality. Is the decrease in price that I've just put on my product or service going to lead to the increase in demand that I was hoping for? How are consumers going to respond to this change in my service offering? Hey, I've just changed my incentive system. How are my employees going to be affected? Are they going to become more motivated? These are all questions of causality. Now, they're complicated questions. They're not quite as simple as, will that red button lead to the light coming on? They're questions about, is our strategy working? Are our decisions leading to the outcomes we want? Complicated questions that are more like this. Questions that involve all kinds of actions you might take. The red button might turn the light on. The blue button might turn it off. The brown button might make it blink. The green button might make the light explode. Our decisions all have outcomes. And as business professionals, then we have to really be thinking a lot about the causality, how our actions will lead to those outcomes. Now, the more experience you have, the more you can learn experientially. But imagine if you can learn vicariously, how many more experiences can aid you in making better decisions going forward. So going back to our last slide, if you really get down to the heart of it, the question is, can I learn more from pushing buttons or from watching other people push buttons? So let's figure out what the theory would tell us about this. Let's start with the experiential learner. If you're an experiential learner, then you are very, very close to the decision. So you see the blue guy there, very close to the dice, saying yes, no, maybe. Very close to the decision. If you're a vicarious learner, you're farther from the decision. Now remember what we learned about Construal. When somebody is psychologically close to a decision, they're going to have a low level of Construal, which means they're going to be focused on details. In fact, we have learned in our research that they can become overly focused on certain details, the details on what has most recently happened. They focused on the most recent results too much. We call this myopia. Now, myopia is a term that you've probably heard when you visited the Emory Eye Center. It means nearsightedness, but it has a greater meaning than just physical vision. It can also mean nearsightedness in making decisions, and this can be forward-looking or backward-looking. In this case, the myopia we are talking about with experiential learners is backward-looking, because people are short-sighted and looking back at the results that they have seen from their decisions. This means they often fail to see the larger pattern of results. They fail to see trends. They miss the big picture. As an aside, one of our very brilliant Ph.D. students from the Rollins School of Public Health is doing research that shows physicians have a certain type of myopia that often causes them to overly focus on recent adverse events that are very salient to them. When something bad happens to one of their patients as a result of their decisions, they become myopic and pay so much attention to that one outcome that they fail to see the bigger picture and understand how over the long haul, how that decision could often lead to better results. So when you're myopic, close psychological distance, you fail to see the big picture. The vicarious learner doesn't have that problem. The vicarious learner, because they have a higher level of Construal, tend to pay attention to all the prior results. They don't have the myopia. So they are able to focus on the patterns and see the big picture. So here's a drum roll moment. Myopia is a particular problem when there's noise in the system. What is noise? Well, noise is anything that makes that causal linkage less than 100% reliable. Suppose you have a button that only works 75% of the time. 75% of the time you hit that red button and the light goes on. Well, if you're myopic and you have just had an experience where you hit the button and the light didn't come on, you might not be able to see that big picture. You're going to focus on that one experience you've just had. And that myopia keeps you from learning that, hey, the red button works pretty well. It's not always working, but it works pretty well. Backing up some psychological distance allows you to see that overall pattern. That psychological distance is what happens with vicarious learning. So a vicarious learner, somebody who is watching the button pushing, that person is going to be able to see that the button works pretty well. So what does this mean for you? I know that you're not particularly interested in red buttons and light bulbs, but if we have learned that the more noise in your system, the more likely vicarious learning is going to be valuable, this is probably important to you, because in most modern workplaces, noise is a big deal. There's a lot of noise in the system. If you're in sales, sometimes the same exact sales approach will work well for one client and not another. An incentive program that works well in one location might not work very well in another location. A product design might be great for a while, but then your customers decide they want a different design. So all of these things are noise in your system. And so vicarious learning is likely going to be very useful. The practical advice here is find ways to encourage vicarious learning. That means networking, finding ways for people to talk to each other about their experiences, substantive communication tools. And by that I mean not just a very high-level newsletter, but a way that different units in the organization can share their own experiences in very substantive ways. Knowledge sharing of all forms is going to be useful to you if you have much noise in the system at all. So let's talk a little bit more about vicarious learning. Take it a little bit further. Are there limits? Yeah. So as you're watching other people learning vicariously, sometimes you're going to see some success, and sometimes you're going to see some failures. Sometimes somebody's going to push the red button and the light's going to come on. Sometimes the light doesn't come on. Sometimes the light bulb explodes. Does that affect your ability to learn vicariously? Well, it turns out that the answer is yes. And that's because there is actually a motivational aspect to psychological distance. Let's assume first that you are seeing somebody else succeed. They're doing great. They just got a promotion. You are going to be motivated to get psychologically closer to that person. We all like to bask in the glow of success. Remember a couple years ago when the Falcons went to the Super Bowl? Everybody in Atlanta, up until that game, was like, we're doing great, we're gonna win, yay us. Well, then the game happened and they screwed up. That is the motivational element of psychological distance. We are attracted to success and we run away from failure. There's been research that shows on college campuses all across our country in the fall, teams that win have a lot more of their student bodies the following Monday wearing the team colors than teams that lose. So, after observing success, you're going to feel close, psychologically close to that person or that situation. People who are psychologically close have a low level of construal. That means they end up focusing on the very concrete details. What our research has shown is that means that People who observe other success, in trying to explain that success, trying to understand why it happens so they can learn from it, they tend to focus quite narrowly on metrics. This person got promoted. Did you notice they met their sales goals 4 periods in a row? Think very closely about specific metrics from, say, a dashboard, a balanced scorecard, some other strategic performance measurement system. On the other hand, when we see people fail, we tend to be much more strategic in our thinking. We try to understand their strategic failures. Oh, this person never really understood where the company was trying to go. That kind of thing. I have seen this personally in a decision that's very close to academic administrators like myself in tenure. Young faculty are always looking at the people who are going up for tenure and the ones trying to understand what's it going to take based on what they are observing from others. And what I've noticed is that when young professors view others who achieved tenure, they tend to have very simple metric-related explanations. That person got tenure, they had 5 publications in premier journals. That's what it takes. All I've got to do now is get 5 publications in premier journals. On the other hand, when they observe somebody who fails to get tenure, they think much more broadly. They learn broadly. They think of things like, this person failed to make a contribution to an important societal challenge, a much broader focus. So what does this mean for you? Well, people learn more broadly from observing others' negative outcomes than from observing others' positive outcomes. Ironically, we're least likely to see negative outcomes from others. These are the things that society shields us from. My advice is to try to build a culture where failure is an option, where people are able to experiment and fail and share that failure. Another piece of advice is to reinforce your goals. When you talk to people in your organization, don't always focus on the performance metric. Focus on the larger goal. Focus on the forest, not the trees. So it's not about having a great EVA or a great EBITDA. It is about financial performance. It is about financial strength, economic stability. Focus on the goals that are large, not just the metrics. Okay, one more study I want to talk to you about, and it relates to this second research question that I've been thinking about for a while. Do we make better decisions for ourselves or for others? This actually started with a happy hour at Everybody's Pizza down at Emory Village, and we were talking about football. I was talking about an inner conflict I was feeling. I really love football. I hate to say this in Atlanta, but I love the New Orleans Saints. And I've been feeling a little bit guilty about it lately because of all the head injuries. And so I was talking to my colleagues and the Ph.D. students who were at the happy hour and saying, I wish there was better regulation. I wish we had better oversight, because I really worry about these young people who are choosing these careers in football. Are they making good decisions, or are they not realizing that in the long run this is going to be so harmful for them that they're making these decisions for money now, not understanding that they are going to hurt their health in the long run? So some of my colleagues were bringing up issues around regulation and Big Brother, and made the argument that these people are making decisions for themselves based on the trade-offs that they understand. And they can certainly make better decisions for themselves than anybody else can. And, well, you know, happy hours with professors are always so much fun. This became a long esoteric discussion that led to this research that I've been doing lately to answer this question. Do we make better decisions for ourselves or for others? So let's go back to the theory on psychological distance and construal. When you're making a decision for yourself, that decision is very, very close to you. And recall what we learned about psychological closeness leading to a low level of construal. And you remember myopia? Well, we see myopia here again, but it's a different type of myopia. When we were talking about myopia before, it was kind of backward looking. Myopia was failing to take into account all the history and instead focusing on most recent outcomes. In this case, we're talking about a forward-looking myopia. So it's the idea that people are not good at considering the long term. People get focused on the short term when they have a low level of construal, which is what happens when you're making decisions for yourself. In other words, you get impulsivity. People doing things for the moment, for now, without thinking about the long-term implications. As you probably can see coming, when you're making decisions for others, the psychological distance is much larger. The construal level is much higher. So you have reduced myopia, less impulsivity. So does this mean you need to let others make your decisions? Well, this is another drum roll moment. It turns out that impulsivity is a particular issue with complex decisions. And very simple decisions that don't have dynamic complexity, people can do pretty well. People can pretty well trade off today versus tomorrow. It's when things get very complicated that people get worse and worse at it. And so impulsivity is a particular problem with complex decisions, which means complex decisions are a domain in which it's particularly useful to have somebody else make your decisions for you. This opens up a can of worms because it brings up all kinds of potential. One piece of advice that I would say that comes from this that isn't too controversial is that you should consider institutionalizing the role of peer advisors. Make sure if you are running an organization that you have a way for your employees to be surrounded by peers who give them advice at the very least. Now, does this also suggest a role for paternalistic regulation and law? I don't have 3 days to go through all the ethical and moral considerations for those questions, but I think this does inform that debate. So let's summarize. Looks like there is value in psychological distance, but it depends. For vicarious learning, it depends on the noise in the system. The noisier the system gets, the better vicarious learning works. And it depends on whether peer outcomes are positive or negative. We actually learn much more broadly when we see negative outcomes than positive. And so we need to find ways to share in a safe space our failures. With delegated decision making, it actually depends on the complexity of the decisions, with more complex decisions benefiting more from delegated decision making or regulation. So that is what I have to say today about the value of psychological distance. I thank you for tuning in, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Towry. We've got a couple of questions that have been submitted. A reminder to everyone as we are asking these of Dr. Towry, if you have any other questions, please type them in the question box. Our first question alludes to the workplace. When you mentioned having sharing mistakes and failures in a workplace, how would you suggest bringing that to a workplace without it being punitive?
Well, like so many things, it begins with culture and tone at the top. I think that we have to find, we have to have leaders who are willing to demonstrate that first. So a leader who is willing to say, oh, we tried this didn't work, it was a mistake, here's what we learned. And so I really feel like the leaders have to first show that they are willing to make mistakes and admit that. Another thing you can consider doing is finding ways to share that without supervisors being around. You know, peer counseling groups where people at one level get together and talk about their experiences without necessarily having the bosses around watching it. Those are just a couple of examples.
Another question along those lines, for a peer advisory panel, how would you implement that without regulation? I think the question is having it not turn into regulation.
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about this more within an organization. Within an organization, it's quite easy to have peer advisory councils. It's up to, you don't even have to have management tell you to do this. You can form your own council, your own peer advisory council within an organization, just by building those connections between your unit and other units in the organization. Now, once we start talking about councils that go outside your organization, those are a whole lot tougher because these are organizations that you're likely competing with, and trust becomes an important element there, and how to build trust. So that becomes a little more complicated. I think I'm going to have to think about that question a little bit before I can give some specific advice. Make sure, please, Lane, let me know if you can, who's asking the questions, because I will be glad to get back to people.
Okay, will do. It looks like our last question deals with wanting to know any tips or any ideas that you've seen where vicarious learning has been rolled out in the business successfully.
Where it has been rolled out, not ruled out, okay. I'm trying to think of a very specific example. A lot of companies are creating what we call knowledge sharing systems that become repositories for the experiences that people are having. Knowledge sharing is becoming increasingly valuable as businesses become more complex and the environment becomes more dynamic, so people are going to have to pivot very quickly. Knowledge management, knowledge sharing systems are one of the best examples I can think of. I was trying to think of a specific firm, but nothing's coming to my mind right now on that, but the general idea of knowledge sharing systems would be what I would focus on there.
Okay, we've got one more question that came in. This seems like a natural fit with, oh, still typing, sorry. Give it just one more minute. This seems like a natural fit with agile work teams. Have you looked at the relationship between agile methodology and the rapidity of learning from failure, making better decisions? Learning is necessary. We have to be intentional about it and make time for it. Sometimes we're so engaged in action that we do not take the time to develop and invest in learning an agenda. Any tips to actually take the time to learn, whether vicariously among peers, learning from others, or failures?
So the first question was, have I done any research looking at the interface between these ideas and agile work teams? I haven't, but I appreciate the tip because that's pretty interesting. And it's a little bit ironic when the question has to do with people have a hard time investing in learning. That is the exact myopia that we've been talking about, because learning is spending time on something for the long term as opposed to for the short term. And so how do we reduce myopia? We try to get other people who are psychologically distant involved. It's much easier to invest in learning if somebody from the outside is looking at it, somebody who's more psychologically distant is looking at you and giving you that advice. So the exact advice I would give in terms of engaging psychologically distant people is exactly what would work here, I think, in terms of investing in learning.
Great. We have another question that's come in. He says your session was very informative. He was wondering if you have any examples of complex decisions where it's better to use delegated decision making. How would one use this information in one's personal life?
Yeah. So I want to be very careful here, because as academics, we tend to dig very, very deeply into something. And I've dug very deeply into this idea of psychological distance and the benefits. I'm not going to ever say, here's a situation that you should delegate, because there's always a whole lot of other context that comes into there. I'm just going to say, here's some benefits of delegation. But I will tell you one personally. If I had listened to my family and friends, I would have married the man of my dreams probably 10 years earlier. They knew he was the right guy for me. I didn't know it. He didn't know it. I absolutely think in your personal life, relationships are a place where we can't totally delegate it. Right? I guess we can. There are arranged marriages in some places, but we can absolutely give our family and friends a large voice in helping us make relationship decisions. And I cannot believe, as an accounting professor, I just went there, but you asked for your personal life.
That was great. That's a good question to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Towry. This has been a wonderful session, and thank you for being available through video. I think that brings a lot of great personal attention to this remote time we're in right now.
Well, I enjoyed it a lot, and help everybody out there, you stay safe. Keep listening to Emory. Keep paying attention to what the doctors are telling you on physical distance, and try to look for the value of psychological distance. Stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Great advice. Thank you so much. And look for the recording later on today in your inbox. And if you have any questions, I will send those along to Dr. Towry to answer. Thank you and have a great day.